Hello, I'm going to attempt to explain creation and how the story of creation in Genesis chapter 1 relate to our understanding today of creation. Does our modern scientific research fit in with these texts that have been handed down to us from our ancestors? Now, Genesis is part of the Jewish Torah and is also part of the Christian Bible. It's the first book of the Christian Bible. And it's a creation described from the viewpoint of Earth. So the best way to picture this is maybe the divine Trinity of God being on Earth itself and creating everything himself, everything around him. I'm talking about the creation of Earth here because there are two ways we can interpret this. One would be the creation of the whole universe, and the other would be just the creation of Earth itself. And what I'd like to do is just look at this in terms of the creation of Earth, just of the planet Earth. And that actually makes it a lot easier to understand, and this could well be what is being described here. Now, who was present during creation? There was no person alive at the time during the first 5 days of creation. So what we have here is God himself describing how he is creating. And he's describing in a way that we can understand as human beings. And also for any age. So whether you were alive in say 1000 AD, or like us being alive at the beginning of the 21st century, or somebody who's going to be alive in say 3000 AD, he's describing it for all of us, no matter what age we live in. And so in doing this, he's not going into some cosmological viewpoint. So he's not describing it from maybe a viewpoint that he could have as he was creating the solar system and the rest of the universe, but he's describing it from a viewpoint that we can understand. And generally human beings live on Earth and we walk around on the surface of this planet, and he's therefore describing creation from this same setting. So from a person who is between 1 and 2 meters tall, and as if they were actually on the planet Earth itself as things were being created. But obviously nobody would be able to survive under those conditions. But just for our own sake and for our own understanding, this is how our God is describing his creation. Now, the book of Genesis, as I said, is part of the Torah, so it's been handed down from the Israelites and the Jews, and is part of the Mosaic tradition of the law. So it comes from that time period, and it is the Word of God himself. So it's God himself describing what he is creating. So let's start, and we'll look at day 1. And now in day 1 it says that the earth was a formless void, and that's in Hebrew, formless and void, so tihu bihu. And so the planet didn't have any regular form. Day 1 describes how God is forming the planet from its various chemicals and giving it shape, giving it form. And so we have this emptiness and this formlessness. Although there are waters here, waters being mayim in Hebrew, but it's not waters as we imagine them today, because remember, by day 1 we didn't have oceans or even clouds in the sky. It was just a mass of liquids, and the waters described here are the liquids which make up so much of the earth's content, and from which God will ultimately bring forth life. And there was darkness because the earth was full of gaseous and liquid particles, and hence the sun was not visible. These liquids were blocking the light of the sun from reaching the earth. And so from this kind of emptiness and formlessness, God creates light and darkness. And so if we think of this in terms of the perspective of what you might experience, God is manifesting light on day one. And so light becomes visible. So as these dense liquids, as they start to thin out, you actually would start to experience light, and you would experience a 12-hour period of light followed by a 12-hour period of darkness if you were at the equator. So you have a sense of the Earth spinning on its axis, and therefore experiencing daytime and nighttime as discernible periods of light and darkness from the viewpoint of an observer in the location of what will be eventually a solid Earth that you'd be able to walk upon. But in day one there is no solidity. It's just a mass of gaseous gases and liquids. And then in day two, God created a vault for the planet called heaven or sky. And there were now clouds above this vault and seas below it. The vault would later become the atmosphere within which all living creatures would dwell. And the narration is describing the separation of waters encircling the planet. So we now have this this formation of this vault, which would become the atmosphere, and we have the clouds above it, and we have the seas below it. So some stabilization is happening now in day two. Now, day three is fairly self-explanatory. We have dry land appearing, and on this vegetation grows. So this is where a time period where the seas allow dry land to appear. And also note that in verse 12 of Genesis 1, it states that the vegetation, each is corresponding to its own species. So it's not one species becoming another species, and we have no experience of that even in today's world. And we can see that maybe the reason why this is written in the Bible is maybe a prophetic word to correct the error of thinking that a species can come from another species. And we also know this from scientific evidence that all vegetation stays within its own species. So as plants create new plants by pollination or whatever means, they only form their own species as a new offspring from the original. Now in day 4, we actually finally have the clouds parting and the sun, moon and stars becoming visible. Now they were always there, but they were not visible because of all of the clouds that were continually covering the earth. But now in day 4, we finally have the clouds parting and we can see the sun, the moon and the stars. So remember, this is being described from the point of view of someone on the Earth's surface, not the point of view of a cosmonaut, for example. In day 5, God creates sea creatures, including fish, mammals, and all the many other classes of water-dwelling species. And God also creates birds to live on the land. And again in verse 21, we see that same phrase repeated, in their own species. And so as as it was for the vegetation, we have all of the animals in the sea and the birds, that they each have their own species, and they do not give birth to a different species through hatching eggs or whatever means. They stay within their own species. And then in day 6, the final day of creation, God creates all of the other species that live on the land, including humans. So there we have the 6 days of creation.